What if I told you that one of the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth, an agency responsible for coups, assassinations, and decades of Cold War shadow games, quietly declassified thousands of documents that contain references to a civilization most historians say never existed? Not a footnote, not a passing remark, real intelligence files stamped, dated, signed, and buried inside them is a name, Tartaria. Now, before you click away, before you roll your eyes, before you assume this is just another rabbit hole, I need you to stay with me for the next few minutes. Because what I found inside these documents doesn't just raise questions about a lost civilization. It raises questions about what governments actually know, about what history actually tells us, and about why certain things, very specific things, seem to vanish from the official record. My name is Sam, and today we are going deep. Let's start at the beginning. Because before we can talk about Tartaria, we need to talk about the documents. In 2017, under a combination of the JFK Records Act and various FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, requests, the CIA released a massive batch of previously classified documents through something called the CREST system. CREST stands for the CIA Records Search Tool. It's a searchable database of millions of declassified records, and most people have no idea it exists. Now, here's the thing about CREST. On the surface, it sounds like a government transparency win, and in many ways it is. Researchers, historians, journalists, they can sift through decades of Cold War intelligence, covert operations, psychological warfare programs, and geopolitical analysis. But within that massive archive, hidden between diplomatic cables and agent reports, are documents that reference historical geographies and civilizations in ways that are unusual. Unusual enough that a growing community of independent researchers has started asking very uncomfortable questions. The documents that specifically mention Tartaria and variations of that name, including Tartary, Grand Tartary, and the Tartarian Empire, appear in a few distinct categories. Category 1. Geographic Intelligence Assessments. These are documents where CIA analysts were mapping out regions, populations, and power structures in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. In several of these documents, they reference historical maps and historical names, and Tartaria comes up repeatedly in that context. Category 2. Psychological Operations Research. This one is where it gets deeply strange. There are documents, and I want to be very precise here, documents that discuss the psychological impact of lost history and suppressed civilization narratives on target populations. The idea being, if you want to destabilize a population, one method is to make them question their own history. Category 3. Academic Correspondence Files. This is the least discussed, but possibly the most explosive category. The CIA, particularly through the 1950s to 1980s, had significant contact with academic institutions, universities, historians, archaeologists. Some of those correspondence files reference debates that were happening inside academia about Central Asian history. And Tartaria, or rather, the question of what Tartaria actually was one of those debates. Now, I want to pause here and be completely transparent with you. I am not telling you that the CIA has a secret file that says Tartaria was real and we've been hiding it. That's not what's in these documents. What is in these documents is more subtle and in some ways more unsettling, because the question isn't just what was Tartaria? The question is, why did an intelligence agency care? To understand why these documents matter, you need to understand what Tartaria actually is. And I mean the real, documented, historical version first. Because here's something that might surprise you. Tartaria was completely real. It's in encyclopedias. It's on maps. It's referenced in official European historical records going back centuries. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory that someone invented on the internet in 2015. Open up a copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica from 1771. You will find an entry for Tartary, spelled Tartary, described as a vast country in the northern parts of Asia, bounded by Siberia to the north and west. The entry goes on to describe its massive geographic scope, stretching from Eastern Europe all the way through Central Asia into what we now call China and Mongolia. Medieval European maps, real maps. Maps that are sitting in museums and libraries right now show a place called Magna Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, occupying an absolutely enormous portion of the known world. We're talking roughly the same landmass as the entire Russian Federation today. So let's establish the mainstream historical understanding first. Historically, Tartary, or Tartaria, was a broad geographic and ethnic term used by European scholars and cartographers to describe the lands and peoples of Central Asia, including the Mongols, the Turkic peoples, and various nomadic cultures. The name itself derives from the Tatars, a group of Turkic-speaking peoples who were often associated with the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors. In medieval European imagination, Tartary was a wild, vast, and powerful place. It was the origin point of the great Mongol invasions that swept through Persia, Russia, Poland, and into the heart of Europe in the 13th century. For European scholars of the time, Tartary was both a geographic designation and an almost mythological one. It was the land beyond the edge of the civilized world. Some medieval writers literally connected the name Tartar to Tartarus, the Greek underworld, because to European Christians, the Mongols seemed to come from hell itself. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European cartographers had become much more precise, and Tartary began to be subdivided. You start seeing Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, independent Tartary, and so on. These distinctions reflected the increasingly complex political reality of Central Asia, the Qing dynasty expanding westward, the Russian Empire pushing east, various khanates rising and falling. And this is the part that starts to get strange, somewhere in the 19th century, the name largely disappears from the maps. Not immediately, not all at once. But gradually, systematically, Tartary is replaced by more specific national and regional names. Mongolia, Siberia, Turkestan, Manchuria, Kazakhstan. The vast conceptual geography of Tartary gets carved up and redistributed into the categories of modern political geography. Mainstream historians have a perfectly reasonable explanation for this. The political landscape changed. The Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty carved up Central Asia between them. The people who once fell under the broad Tartar umbrella now had more specific political identities. The geographic concept of Tartary became obsolete, and cartographic precision replaced it. That's the official story, and honestly, it's largely correct, but here is where things get complicated. And this is where the CIA documents start to matter in a very different way. There's a community, a large and growing community of independent researchers, amateur historians, and what you might call alternative history enthusiasts, who look at the mainstream explanation and say, something doesn't add up. And their argument isn't crazy. Let me walk you through it. Argument 1, the architectural anomaly. When you look at 19th century photographs, real photographs from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s of cities in the American Midwest, in South America, in Central Asia, in parts of Russia and Eastern Europe, you notice something striking. There are buildings in these photographs that appear extraordinarily advanced for their supposed age and location. Massive, ornate, domed public buildings. Enormous arched colonnades, grand avenues lined with classical architecture. And the mystery isn't just that they look impressive. It's that official historical records often attribute these buildings to having been constructed in an incredibly short period of time, by relatively small populations, without the industrial infrastructure we'd expect. The Tartaria community looks at these buildings and says, these weren't built by the people history credits them to. They were inherited. They're remnants of an earlier, more advanced civilization. And that civilization was Tartaria. Now, professional historians and architects have responses to this. They point to documented construction records, architectural analyses, period accounts of construction. The mainstream explanation is, 19th century architecture really was that impressive, particularly in an era of rapid industrialization when governments were investing heavily in grand civic buildings. But the alternative researchers fire back. Where are the construction records for some of these specific buildings? Why do certain official histories have such thin documentation for such massive construction projects? Argument 2. The mud flood theory. This is perhaps the most bizarre and most discussed element of the Tartaria phenomenon. The mud flood theory proposes that at some point, theorists suggest the late 18th or early 19th century, a catastrophic geological or atmospheric event buried an enormous amount of the world's surface under layers of mud and sediment. The evidence cited includes buildings in old photographs that appear to have their ground floors partially underground, windows that start at what appears to be below street level, doors that open onto what look like below-grade spaces. The theory holds that this event, whatever caused it, essentially wiped out or severely depopulated Tartaria, and that the powers that emerged afterward, the Russian Empire, the newly forming United States, the European colonial powers, essentially reset history. They took credit for existing infrastructure, repopulated regions with their own settlers, and scrubbed the historical record of the civilization that had come before. Geologists and historians reject this almost universally. The mainstream explanation for sunken buildings is simply urban development. Cities raise their street levels over time as they're built up layer by layer. And buildings built in earlier eras end up with their lower floors below current street grade. It's a completely ordinary and well-documented phenomenon. But here's the question the alternative researchers keep coming back to. If all of this is so easily explained, why does the mainstream academic world seem so utterly uninterested in even engaging with these questions? And this is where we circle back to the CIA. Argument 3, the suppression hypothesis. The most extreme version of the Tartaria theory holds that the historical record wasn't just naturally replaced, it was actively suppressed. That powerful institutions, governments, academic bodies, perhaps even the Catholic Church and later international intelligence agencies, cooperated to erase Tartaria from history, to replace a memory of a vast, advanced, perhaps even spiritually different civilization with the history we have now. And the people making this argument point to, among other things, the CIA documents. Because if the CIA was studying lost civilization narratives as a psychological operations tool, doesn't that imply they knew that such narratives had power? And if they knew they had power, doesn't that raise the question of whether they were managing such narratives, not just studying them? Pause for effect. I'm going to be honest with you. That last logical leap, from the CIA studied this as a psyop tool, to the CIA is suppressing knowledge of Tartaria, is a big one. It's a leap that requires a lot of additional evidence to justify. But the fact that the question can even be asked, the fact that real CIA documents are part of this conversation, is what makes this story different from most alternative history narratives. Let me get specific, because if we're going to talk about CIA documents, we need to actually talk about what's in them, not just wave our hands at the idea that they exist. The documents that are most cited in Tartaria research communities fall into a few categories. I've gone through the CREST database and cross-referenced with documents that have been flagged by independent researchers. Here's what I found. Document Set 1, the historical geography files. These are relatively uncontroversial. CIA analysts in the 1950s and 1960s were producing geographic and demographic assessments of Central Asia, partly because of Cold War interest in Soviet territorial control, and partly because of geopolitical analysis related to China, Afghanistan, and the various Soviet satellite states in the region. In these documents, the term Tartary and Tartarian appear in historical context, analysts referencing old European maps and historical geographic designations to understand how the region's identity had changed over time. This is normal academic and intelligence practice. Understanding a region's historical identity can help you understand its current political dynamics. What's interesting is the detail with which some of these documents discuss the historical erasure of regional identities. One document, I won't give you a specific file number because I want you to go look this up yourself rather than just take my word for it. One document discusses how the Soviet Union systematically replaced regional and ethnic identities in Central Asia with Soviet ones. The obliteration of historical memory as a political tool. In that context, it references how earlier European powers had done the same thing, noting that the very concept of Tartary had been disaggregated by Russian imperial expansion. Reading that, you start to understand something important. The erasure of historical identity from maps and records is not a conspiracy theory. It's a real documented tool of imperial and political power. The CIA knew it. They studied it. They wrote about it. Document Set 2, the psychological operations research. This is where the documents get genuinely interesting, and where I want to be very careful about what I'm claiming. There is a body of CIA research, much of it from the 1950s through the 1970s, that examines the psychological impact of historical narratives on populations. This research was part of the broader psychological warfare apparatus of the Cold War. The basic idea: you can destabilize enemy populations by undermining their belief in their own history, their own institutions, their own identity. Within this research, there are documents that discuss what analysts called alternative historical narratives, stories that contradicted the official historical record and were spreading through certain populations. These documents analyze why such narratives spread, what psychological needs they fulfill, and how they might be countered or, in some cases, amplified for strategic purposes. Now, do these documents specifically mention Tartaria as one of these alternative narratives? In the documents I've been able to access, the answer is not by name, with one potential exception. There is one document, flagged by multiple researchers in the Tartaria community, that refers to pre-imperial Eurasian civilization narratives, circulating in certain Soviet-adjacent intellectual circles. The document is partially redacted, but researchers who have analyzed the context argue that this is a reference to exactly the kind of historical revisionism that the Tartaria theory represents, the idea that there was a significant pre-Russian, pre-Mongol, pre-modern civilization in Eurasia that has been written out of history. I want to be clear, that interpretation is contested. A CIA historian would probably tell you that this document is referring to something much more specific, perhaps specific Soviet-era historical revisionism for propaganda purposes. But the ambiguity is real, and the ambiguity itself is worth examining. Document Set 3, Academic Correspondence. The CIA's involvement with academia during the Cold War is now very well documented. Programs like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which the CIA secretly funded, were designed to influence intellectual discourse in the West and in developing nations. The CIA funded academic journals, conferences, and research programs. Within the files related to these programs, there are correspondence records that touch on Central Asian history and archaeology. Some of these touch on genuinely fascinating debates about the origins of the Silk Road, about the sophistication of pre-Mongol Central Asian civilizations like those of Samarkand and Bukhara, about the archaeological record of the Eurasian steppe. What the Tartaria community finds interesting in these documents is the pattern. The CIA appears to have had opinions about which historical narratives of Central Asia were acceptable and which were not. They were, at least in some cases, in the business of shaping how history was written and taught. Is that evidence that they suppressed knowledge of Tartaria? Not directly. But it is evidence that intelligence agencies were willing and able to influence historical narratives. And once you know that, you start to look at the gaps in the historical record differently. Let's zoom out, because the Tartaria story doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger global phenomenon of people questioning what I'd call the authorized history of the world. Look at the Tartaria community online and you'll find something surprising. It's not a fringe of basement-dwelling cranks. It's millions of people. On TikTok, on YouTube, on Reddit, on Telegram, the Tartaria hashtag has generated billions of views. There are documentary series, books, academic-adjacent research papers, and dedicated websites with thousands of contributors. Now, part of that is just the nature of internet rabbit holes. The algorithm rewards engagement, and alternative history is deeply engaging. But part of it is something more substantive. People around the world, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Turkey, in the United States, in Brazil, in India, are looking at the physical evidence around them and saying, "This doesn't match what I was taught." They're pointing to the Star Fort phenomenon. Across the globe, from Europe to North America to South America, there are extraordinary star-shaped fortifications, many of which appear on old maps but have murky or contradictory construction histories. The Tartaria community argues these are remnants of an advanced earlier civilization with a unified architectural tradition. Mainstream historians explain them as standard European military architecture that spread through colonialism, the orphan trains and repopulation hypothesis. One of the more disturbing threads in Tartaria theory involves the 19th century orphan trains in America, a real historical phenomenon where orphaned or poor children were transported from eastern cities to rural areas. Tartaria theorists suggest this was actually a repopulation effort, that the Americas had been depopulated by some catastrophic event connected to the mud flood and needed to be resettled. Historians note that the orphan trains are well-documented charitable and social welfare initiatives with no mysterious dimensions. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, the White City, Chicago. This one genuinely fascinates me, and I think it deserves careful attention. The 1893 World's Fair in Chicago featured an enormous complex of gleaming white neoclassical buildings, the White City, that stunned visitors from around the world. The buildings were demolished after the fair. The question the Tartaria community asks: how did late 19th century America build such an enormous, sophisticated complex so quickly? And why tear it all down? The mainstream answer: they were built from temporary materials, steel frames and plaster, specifically designed to be constructed quickly and then demolished. But the Tartaria answer: these weren't built from scratch at all. They were pre-existing structures, remnants of the earlier civilization, dressed up, and then destroyed to eliminate the evidence. I want to stop here and say something directly. On the specific details, the mainstream explanations are better supported by evidence than the alternative ones. Construction records exist for the White City. We have photographs of it being built. We have accounts from workers who built it. But the Tartaria community raises a question that I think deserves a direct answer, rather than dismissal. Why does the process of historical documentation seem so much more robust for some things than for others? Why do we have incredibly detailed records for some historical events and almost nothing for others? Why do official histories sometimes seem to tell stories that are just a little too neat, a little too convenient, a little too aligned with the interests of the powers that wrote them? These aren't crazy questions. They're the questions that serious historians ask too. The difference is in the conclusions drawn from those questions. I want to take a step back from the specific claims of the Tartaria theory and talk about something that I think is actually at the heart of why this story matters so much to so many people. We live in an era of institutional distrust, and that distrust isn't irrational, it's earned. We've watched governments lie about weapons of mass destruction. We've learned that the CIA ran secret programs that included illegal human experimentation. MK Ultra is a matter of public record. We've seen how financial institutions manipulated global markets and faced almost no consequences. We've watched pharmaceutical companies downplay addiction risks. We've seen social media companies manipulate our feeds for engagement. And we've learned, in the decades since the Cold War, that intelligence agencies really were in the business of manipulating history. The CIA's Operation Mockingbird, the program to influence domestic and foreign media, is documented. The FBI's COINTELPRO, the surveillance and disruption of civil rights leaders, is documented. The British government's manipulation of historical accounts of colonialism is documented. So when someone says to you, "What if the history you were taught was shaped by powerful interests?" the correct answer isn't "that's crazy." The correct answer is, yes, sometimes it has been. Let's look at the evidence. The Tartaria theory at its best is an expression of that impulse. It's people who have lost faith in authoritative narratives, looking at the physical world around them, and trying to construct an alternative account that feels truer to their experience of institutional dishonesty. At its worst, the Tartaria theory can slide into something darker, into the idea that we, whatever we is, are the rightful inheritors of a lost civilization, and that the current order has stolen that inheritance. You can hear the ethno-nationalist undertones in some corners of the Tartaria community, and it's important to name them honestly. The idea of a white, Tartarian civilization being erased by non-European powers has attracted some genuinely racist theorists, and that dimension of the community deserves clear condemnation. But the existence of bad faith actors who have colonized an idea doesn't invalidate the underlying question. And the underlying question, what did we lose in the transitions of the 19th century and who decided what would be remembered, is a genuinely important one. Let me bring this back to the CIA documents, because I think the significance of those documents has been both overstated and understated, depending on which community is talking about them. The Tartaria community overstates it when they say, the CIA documents prove that the agency is hiding knowledge of a lost civilization. That's not what the documents show. What they show is that CIA analysts were aware of historical geographic designations like Tartary, that they studied alternative historical narratives as psychological tools, and that they were involved in shaping academic discourse in ways that weren't always transparent. But mainstream dismissers understated the significance when they say, these documents are perfectly mundane intelligence files that have nothing interesting in them. Because if that were true, you wouldn't need heavily redacted sections in documents about historical geography. Here's what I think is actually going on, and this is my honest interpretation after spending significant time with this material. The CIA, like all intelligence agencies, became expert in the relationship between historical narrative and power. They understood better than most that controlling the story of the past is one of the most effective ways to control the present. They funded academics. They cultivated relationships with historians. They had opinions about how certain regions should be historically understood. That doesn't make them puppets of a Tartarian suppression conspiracy. But it does mean that the academic history of Central Asia, and by extension, the history of the civilization or civilizations that preceded the current world order, was shaped by political and strategic interests as well as pure scholarly inquiry. And that matters, not because Tartaria was necessarily a global empire that has been entirely erased, but because it means the official historical record of the world's most contested regions is not a neutral, objective document. It's a product of competing interests, political pressures, and strategic calculations, which means there might be more to know. There might be history that hasn't been fully excavated. There might be stories that haven't been fully told. And the CIA's involvement, even in the limited, documented ways we can trace, is a reminder that the people in power have always had strong opinions about what the rest of us should believe about the past. Here's something the extreme fringes of the Tartaria community often miss. There is genuine, mainstream, peer-reviewed archaeology and history that paints a picture of pre-modern Central Asia that is far more sophisticated and far less understood than most Westerners realize. The Silk Road civilizations, Sogdia, Bactria, Khorzum, were extraordinary. The city of Samarkand at its height was arguably one of the most cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and advanced cities on Earth. The Timurid dynasty in the 15th century produced architecture, scholarship, mathematics, and art that rivaled anything in Renaissance Europe. Ulugh Beg built an astronomical observatory in Samarkand in the early 1400s that produced star charts accurate to within seconds of modern measurements. The kingdom of Kievan Rus, predecessor to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, was deeply integrated into Byzantine and Scandinavian trade networks. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire in history and functioned as an extraordinarily efficient trans-Eurasian communication and trade system. What some historians have called the Pax Mongolica, none of this is secret. It's all well documented, but here's the thing, it's barely taught in Western schools. The average American or British student learns almost nothing about Central Asian history. They know about Rome, they know about Greece, they know about the European Middle Ages, but the vast, complex, sophisticated history of Eurasia between China and Europe is essentially invisible to them. Could that invisibility be partly political? Could the emphasis on European historical narrative in Western education be partly a product of the same colonial and imperial interests that shaped the CIA's academic partnerships? I think the honest answer is yes, not as a conspiracy, but as the natural result of educational systems built by European-descended cultures to serve the interests of European-descended nations. And if that's true, then the Tartaria community, even when their specific claims are wrong, is pointing at something real. The selective, interest-driven, politically shaped nature of the history we're taught. After all of this, after the documents, after the theories, after the mainstream counterarguments and the legitimate historical questions, where does that leave us? I want to be honest with you. Here's what I know, what is confirmed. Tartaria, or Tartary, was a real geographic and cultural concept used by European scholars and cartographers for centuries to describe a vast region of Eurasia. The concept largely disappeared from mainstream maps and educational curricula in the 19th and early 20th centuries, replaced by more precise national and regional designations. CIA documents do reference Tartary and Tartarian in historical context, and CIA programs did engage with alternative historical narratives as part of psychological operations research. The CIA, through programs like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, did work to shape academic discourse in ways that weren't always transparent. Mainstream academic history of Central Asia is dramatically underrepresented in Western education, partly due to the Eurocentric nature of Western educational systems. What is contested? Whether the disappearance of Tartaria from maps represents deliberate suppression or natural historical evolution. Whether buildings in old photographs represent evidence of a prior advanced civilization, or simply the impressive but documentable architecture of 19th century industrialization. Whether any catastrophic event, a mud flood or otherwise, contributed to a historical discontinuity in the 18th or 19th century. Whether CIA documents represent evidence of active suppression of Tartarian history or simply standard intelligence practice. What is not supported by the current evidence? That Tartaria was a global empire with advanced technology superior to any other known civilization. That there was a deliberate, coordinated global conspiracy to erase Tartaria from history. That the CIA is actively hiding proof of Tartaria's existence. That the mud flood was a real event that buried a civilization. But here's what I want to leave you with, and this is the thought I keep coming back to. The fact that a question can't be conclusively answered with current evidence doesn't mean the question isn't worth asking. In fact, sometimes the most important questions are exactly the ones that our official institutions are least equipped or least willing to answer. When the CIA was interested in how lost civilization narratives spread through populations, that interest tells us something. It tells us those narratives have power. It tells us they resonate with something deep in human psychology, the feeling that the story we've been told isn't the whole story, that there's something underneath, something older, something that the powers of the present day would rather we didn't think about too hard. Whether that something is literally a lost empire called Tartaria, I'm genuinely not sure. But I am sure of this: the impulse to ask the question is healthy. The impulse to distrust official narratives, not blindly but carefully with evidence in hand, is healthy. And the impulse to look at the world around you and ask, wait, how did this actually get here, is one of the most human impulses there is. The CIA released those documents. They're online, right now. You can search them. The maps are in museums and universities. The old photographs are digitized. The buildings are still standing, many of them in cities across the world. The evidence isn't hidden. It's not locked in a vault somewhere. It's available to anyone who wants to look. And maybe that's the real point of all of this. Maybe the answer to the question of Tartaria isn't in some secret government archive. Maybe it's in the willingness to look at the world with fresh eyes, to refuse the neat official story, to sit with uncertainty, to be comfortable not knowing while never stopping the search. Because the most dangerous thing isn't a world where all the answers are hidden. It's a world where we stop asking the questions. So go look at the documents, go study the maps, go read the history of the Silk Road, of the Mongols, of the Timurid dynasty, of the steppe empires that our schools never taught us about. The truth is out there. And unlike some things the CIA has gotten up to, it might actually be declassified. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This is the kind of story I find myself thinking about for weeks after I first encounter it. Not because I think Tartaria was literally a global empire that's been erased, but because of what the story represents. We live in a time when institutional trust is fracturing. And the question is whether that fracture leads us toward better, more critical thinking, or toward paranoid, untethered belief in anything that challenges authority. My hope is that videos like this one help with the former, that we can be skeptical and rigorous, that we can ask hard questions and demand real evidence. If that sounds like your kind of thing, subscribe, hit the bell, and let me know in the comments, what do you think about the Tartaria theory? Are we looking at the echo of a lost world, or the very human desire to find one? Either way, the search continues.